Have you ever looked back on a difficult season of your life and realized that the warning signs were there all along? The exhaustion, the frustration, the strained relationships, the growing sense that something wasn't right. And none of it appeared overnight. It was happening in plain sight. You just weren't seeing it yet. That isn't criticism, it's part of being human. We rarely notice our lives while we're busy living them. We notice them afterwards, when the opportunity is already passed, when the conversation can't be taken back, when another year has quietly slipped by, when we finally ask ourselves, how did I end up here? Most of the time, the answer isn't hidden, it's just simply overlooked. That's why one of the greatest skills you can develop isn't working harder, becoming more disciplined, or learning another productivity system. It's learning to observe, not the world at first, yourself. Most people spend their lives trying to improve behaviors they've never taken the time to understand. They try to fix habits before noticing what triggers them. They chase motivation before understanding what drains it. They pursue clarity without first paying attention to the confusion they're already living with. The SRS begins somewhere much quieter. It begins with observation because you cannot intentionally change what you have not first intentionally observed. Now, that sounds simple. It is, but simple doesn't mean easy. Observation asks us to slow down in a culture that rewards speed, to become curious in a culture that rushes towards conclusions, to notice before judging, to understand before fixing, and that changes everything. One of my favorite things about becoming more aware is that the world itself doesn't suddenly change. You do. You begin noticing conversations you've been rushing through, patterns you've been repeating, thoughts you've been accepting without question, moments that would have slipped past you only weeks before. It's as though someone cleaned a window that you didn't realize was dirty. The landscape was always there. Now you can finally see it. Observation doesn't create reality, it reveals the reality that was waiting to be noticed. That is the beginning of intentional living. Not changing your life overnight, but learning to see your life clearly enough to know what actually needs to change. Because the person who learns to observe their life gains the power to intentionally change it. One of the greatest obstacles to personal growth isn't a lack of intelligence. It isn't a lack of opportunity. It isn't even a lack of motivation. It's living too quickly to notice what's actually happening. Most people don't intentionally ignore their lives, they're simply consumed by them. The alarm goes off, the day begins, emails arrive, messages demand attention, responsibilities compete for space. Before long, another day has passed. Busy, productive perhaps, but largely unexamined. And that's the danger. You can become incredibly efficient at repeating a life you've never stopped to observe. Imagine trying to improve your golf swing while refusing to watch a recording of yourself. You might feel like you're making better contact with the ball. You might believe your posture has improved. You might even become more confident, but until you actually see what you're doing, you're relying on assumptions instead of reality. Life works the same way. Most of us don't live according to reality. We live according to our perception of reality. And those aren't always the same thing. We often believe we're patient until someone interrupts us. We believe we're good listeners until we notice how often we interrupt. We believe we value our health until we honestly observe how we spend our evenings. Observation has a way of exposing the quiet contradictions between our intentions and our behavior. That can be uncomfortable, but discomfort isn't the enemy, deception is. Many people avoid self observation because they're afraid of what they'll discover. They worry they'll find failure, weakness, inconsistency. What they usually discover instead is understanding. One of the most important shifts you ever make is replacing self criticism with self curiosity. Those are not the same thing. Criticism asks, what's wrong with me? Curiosity asks, what's happening here? One question produces shame, the other produces insight. Shame makes us want to hide. Insight gives us something to work with. That's why becoming the observer of your life is so powerful. You're no longer acting as a prosecutor trying to prove your own guilt. You're becoming a student trying to understand how your life actually works. That change in perspective removes much of the fear surrounding personal growth because you're no longer searching for evidence that you're broken. You're gathering information that helps you grow. And growth always begins with accurate observation, not imagined observation, not hopeful observation, honest observation. Because you cannot improve a life you're unwilling to see clearly. Observation is more than a skill, it's a way of relating to your own life. Most people believe they know themselves because they've lived with themselves for years, but familiarity isn't the same as understanding. You can live in the same house for decades and stop noticing the cracks in the wall. You can drive the same road every day and forget what the landscape looks like. You can become so accustomed to your own thoughts, habits, and reactions that they begin to feel inevitable rather than chosen. That's why observation requires distance. Not physical distance, but mental distance. The ability to step back and ask, what is actually happening right now? Instead of, what do I assume is happening? That small shift changes everything. It transforms you from the actor inside the story into the observer capable of understanding it. The ancient Stoics practiced this intentionally. They understood that before you can govern your life, you must first learn to see it clearly, not through the lens of emotion, not through the lens of ego, but through honest attention. Now, the Sherman Rivers System builds on that same principle. Observation isn't passive, it's one of the most active things you can do because what you consistently observe, you eventually understand. And what you truly understand, you can begin to change. Think about a scientist studying a new phenomenon. The first step isn't changing it, it's observing it patiently, carefully, without forcing a conclusion. Imagine if a scientist walked into a laboratory, glanced at an experiment for 5 seconds, and declared they already knew the answer. We would call that poor science. And that's why curiosity is one of the most powerful qualities that you can develop. Curiosity slows you down. It asks better questions. It keeps learning long after certainty would have stopped looking. Instead of asking, why am I like this? The observer asks, what keeps leading me here? Instead of saying, this is just who I am, the observer wonders, when did this pattern begin? Those questions create possibility because they assume growth is still available. Perhaps the greatest gift observation offers us is hope. Not the kind that waits for life to improve on its own, but the kind that comes from finally seeing your life clearly enough to know where meaningful change can happen. Observation doesn't demand perfection, it only asks for honesty. And honesty is where every intentional life begins. Observation only becomes valuable when it changes the way you move through your day. Otherwise, it's just another interesting idea. That's why I want to leave you with something practical. Not another philosophy, but a practice. Tomorrow morning, before you pick up your phone, pause. Not because the phones are bad, not because technology is your enemy, but because the first moments of your day often reveal what has your attention before you've consciously or consciously chosen it. Notice what your mind reaches for. Notice the thoughts that greet you. Notice what feels urgent. Notice what you're already worrying about before your feet even touch the floor. Don't try to change it. just observe. Later in the day, pay attention to a conversation, not only to another person, pay attention to yourself. Notice how quickly you prepare your next response. Notice what makes you defensive. Notice what makes you curious. Notice the moments when you're listening and the moments when you're simply waiting to speak. Again, don't judge yourself. Observe. Then at the end of the day, spend 5 quiet minutes asking a simple question. What did I notice about myself today? Not what did I accomplish? Not did I have a good day? But simply, what did I notice? You may discover that you're more distracted than you realized, or more impatient, or more anxious. You may also discover something encouraging. Perhaps you're becoming more thoughtful, more present, more intentional than you were only a few weeks ago. Those discoveries matter because they give you something real to build on. One of the reasons journaling can be so powerful isn't because writing magically changes your life. It's because writing slows your thinking long enough for observation to catch up. You begin seeing connections that were invisible while you were rushing through the day. You notice patterns. You remember conversations. You recognize emotional triggers. Most importantly, you begin developing a relationship with yourself based on truth instead of assumption. That's today's daily focus. Become an observer before you become an editor. Don't spend the day trying to fix yourself. Spend the day learning yourself. Watch your thoughts, watch your habits, watch your reactions. Not with criticism, but with curiosity. Because the quality of your observations will ultimately determine the quality of your decisions. And better decisions are how better lives are built. Take a moment and think about the people you've admired the most throughout your life. The ones who seem calm under pressure, wise in difficult situations, grounded when everyone else is reacting. If you pay close attention, you'll notice something they often have in common. They don't simply experience life, they pay attention to it. They notice what others overlook. They recognize patterns before they become problems. They listen more carefully. They reflect more honestly. They question themselves more willingly. In other words, they've learned to become observers. That's the real purpose of this lesson. Not to encourage endless self-analysis, not to convince you to overthink every decision, but to help you develop the habit of paying attention to the one life you'll never have the opportunity to live again. Observation is an act of respect. It says, my life is worth understanding. It refuses to rush past experiences that have something to teach. It chooses curiosity over certainty, reflection over reaction, growth over ego. Over the last 5 lessons, we've quietly been changing the way you relate to yourself. You've learned to become aware. You've learned to recognize patterns. You learn to understand systems. You learn to interrupt autopilot with intentional choice. And now you've learned something equally important: to watch your own life with honesty instead of judgment. Because observation isn't about proving whether you're succeeding or failing. It's about seeing clearly enough to know exactly what's actually true. And truth is always a better foundation for growth than assumption. Imagine standing on a mountain overlooking a valley. From that height, roads that once seemed confusing suddenly make sense. You can see how everything connects: the turns, the intersections, the direction each path eventually leads. Observation gives you that same perspective. It lifts you above the noise of individual moments so you can finally understand the direction your life is taking. It lifts you above the noise of the individual moments so you can finally understand the direction your life is taking. And once you see your direction, you can intentionally change it. That's why Becoming the observer of your life is not merely the first skill of personal growth, it's the one you'll return to for the rest of your life. Every new season will ask you to observe again. Every new challenge will invite deeper awareness. Every meaningful level of growth begins by seeing what is true today. So before you rush into tomorrow, pause, look carefully, notice what your life has been trying to teach you. Because the person who learns to observe their life gains the power to intentionally change it. Before moving to the next lesson, spend a few quiet moments with these questions. What did you notice about yourself this week you had never recognized before? Where are your actions consistently different from your intentions? Which patterns deserve your attention before it becomes a larger problem? What would you change if you approached yourself with curiosity instead of criticism? Don't rush your answers. Observation takes patience. And patience almost always reveals what hurry overlooks. Let's continue the journey. Observation is giving you something incredibly valuable: perspective. You no longer have to guess why certain patterns continue repeating. You're learning to see them, you're learning to understand them. And because you can see them, you now have the ability to change them. But one challenge still remains. Even when you become more aware, even when you observe your habits honestly, even when you begin making intentional choices, your attention is still limited. You cannot focus on everything at once. So the next question becomes, what deserves your attention first? Because one of the most important skills you'll ever develop isn't simply paying attention, it's directing your attention toward what matters most. And that's where we're going next. Until then, keep observing, keep asking better questions, keep replacing judgment with curiosity, because the life you eventually build will always be shaped by what you first learn to see. And the observer who remains curious never stops growing, because every lasting transformation begins with the courage to honestly see.